the emperor of the Vetharak Dominion, had not laughed in 30 years. He laughed now. The holographic display above the throne room rendered the third planet of a yellow dwarf star in the Orion Arm, a small, wet world swathed in white cloud and blue ocean, orbited by a single pockmarked moon. His chief intelligence officer, Prelate San, stood at rigid attention nearby, watching his sovereign's amusement with the practiced stillness of a man who had served 4 different emperors and outlasted all of them. "They call it Earth," the emperor said, tasting the word like something foreign on his tongue. "Tell me again, how many ships do they have in orbit?" 43, Your Radiance. Fragile orbital stations, mostly research and logistics. Their most advanced vessel does not exceed 300 meters in length. Their surface-launched weapons are chemically propelled. Prelate San paused. They have not yet achieved faster-than-light travel. And yet someone thought this species worth reporting to my desk. They are prolific, Your Radiance. 3 centuries ago they had not left their own atmosphere. Now they have permanent colonies on 4 bodies within their system, with a 5th under construction. Their industrial output doubles every 19 standard years. San chose his next words with the care of a man walking a narrow bridge. They also engage in continuous armed conflict amongst themselves, and they have never in their recorded history stopped improving how they do it. The emperor waved a hand. The data meant nothing to him. The Vetharak Dominion spanned 47 star systems. They had absorbed species that breathed methane and species that communicated through bioluminescent skin flares, and species that had been crossing interstellar distances for a full millennium before the Vetharak ever looked upward. Not one war in 300 years had ended in Vetharak defeat. Not one engagement, not one campaign, not one border skirmish had ever produced a Vetharak retreat that wasn't followed within the year by complete annihilation of the opposing force. "Send Fleet Admiral Sarath," the emperor said, already turning away. "Give him 1,200 ships of the line. Tell him I want the 3rd planet pacified before the next cycle of the Harvest Festival. I want every species within 100 light-years watching the broadcast." He settled back into the carved obsidian chair that had seated 62 emperors before him. "Let them understand what happens when we arrive." Prelate San bowed low and held the bow, as etiquette required when one disagreed with an emperor but valued one's continued existence. He had developed this particular bow into a fine art over 3 decades of service. "Your Radiance," he said carefully, face hidden at the correct angle. "The advanced scouts report certain anomalies in the human's orbital behavior. Communication patterns our analysts have been unable to decrypt, and unusual thermal signatures consistent with large-scale underground construction at San." "Yes, Your Radiance." "I did not ask for a risk assessment. I asked for a fleet." "Of course, Your Radiance." Fleet Admiral Sarath received the edict 6 hours later, alone in his private quarters aboard the carrier Veth Sarath, the ship that bore his family name. He was a veteran of 9 separate campaigns, a strategist whose tactical mind was considered among the finest the Dominion had produced in 2 generations. He read the intelligence files on humanity not once but 12 times, over 11 consecutive days, sleeping in his chair, eating without tasting, reading every field report, every sensor log, every analyst note. On the 12th day, he submitted his fleet manifest and operational timeline without complaint. He also wrote a private note, 3 drafts of it, each beginning, "Your Radiance, I respectfully request additional reconnaissance before committing primary fleet assets." Each draft was deleted before transmission, not because he didn't believe the words, because he understood, with the cold clarity of a man who had served empires long enough to know their limits, that the edict left no room for wisdom. The Harvest Festival was already scheduled. 1,200 warships began their journey toward a small blue world, trailing fire in the dark between the stars. The alert reached Dr. Hannah Voss at 3:14 in the morning, and she answered it before the second ping. She was already awake. She was always already awake these days. The message was 3 lines from the Deep Array monitoring station on the lunar far side. Fleet confirmed. Inbound. Estimated arrival, 187 days. Mass consistent with Capital Class Engagement Group. Numbers, approximately 1,200 vessels. She sat with it in the dark of her apartment, coffee cooling on the desk, Reykjavik glowing amber through rain-streaked glass, the city outside impossibly ordinary. She gave herself exactly 90 seconds to feel the weight of it. Then she got dressed, called her driver, and went to work. By noon, she was standing in the United Earth Defense Council chamber in Geneva, in front of 12 people who collectively represented every major military alliance on the planet, most of whom looked like they had spent the morning discovering that breathing was difficult. 1,200 warships, said General Marcus Webb of the Atlantic Command. He was 61 years old, and he had the voice of a man who had spent 4 decades making impossible situations sound manageable. Right now, even he couldn't quite manage it. Against our 43 orbital platforms and 600 atmospheric fighters. Yes, said Dr. Voss. That isn't a war, said Admiral Chen Li of the Pacific Fleet. That's a public execution. That depends entirely, said Dr. Voss, on whether we let them choose the method. She placed a data tablet on the table. Nobody reached for it. She didn't wait for them to. Everything we've gathered confirms they are a conventional military power, and a brilliant one. They fight to achieve dominance through overwhelmingly superior force, applied in the shortest possible time. They expect a command structure they can identify and destroy, a fleet they can engage on known terms, a planet that will signal surrender before the bombardment reaches the civilian zones. She looked around the table, making eye contact with each person in turn. They expect us to behave the way every other species they've conquered has behaved. And we won't, said General Webb. We cannot, said Dr. Voss. Not with what we have in orbit, but that's not actually what we're doing. She pushed the data tablet to the center of the table. We're going to do what we have always done to each other for 10,000 years, whenever the enemy was larger and better equipped and more certain of victory. She opened the tablet. Schematics, logistics chains, manufacturing schedules, and orbital seating patterns unfolded across the chamber's display surface. Buried at the back of the document was a project proposal that had been sitting in a classified server for 9 years under the designation Deep Anchor, Contingency Class Omega. The room went quiet in a very specific way, not the quiet of people who were confused. The quiet of people reading something and understanding, word by word, exactly what they were looking at. You've already started building it, said Admiral Chen Li, her voice flat. Sections of it, said Dr. Voss. We need 187 days to finish all 6 arrays. Webb stared at the display for a long moment. His face did the slow, careful calculation of a man who had spent his life in military planning, and knew exactly what 187 days meant when 1,200 warships were already in transit. How certain are you? He asked. Dr. Voss picked up her cold coffee, considered it, set it back down. I am certain we are the only species in this arm of the galaxy that has spent 10,000 years in unbroken, continuous warfare against itself. I am certain we have learned things about fighting that no species that only fights outward ever has to learn. She looked at the window, then back at the room. I am certain that they have never in 300 years of conquest met anyone like us. And that is the only advantage we need. Nobody argued. Nobody asked for a second opinion. They began building that same afternoon. All of them. All at once. Advance frigates 7, 11, and 19 entered the human solar system 14 weeks before the main fleet, running dark under standard reconnaissance protocol. Their orders were routine: catalog orbital defenses, identify surface installations, map command infrastructure, estimate population density in key zones. Fleet Admiral Sareth had run this preliminary protocol 39 times across 9 campaigns. The frigates would return in 3 weeks with a complete tactical picture. They always did. Frigate 19 never returned. Not a distress signal, not a damaged hull drifting, not even debris on the sensor sweep. Just silence where a warship and 40 crew had been. Frigate 11 came back 11 days early, running on emergency thrust with 2 of its 3 power cores offline, and its hull showing impact scarring consistent with close-range ordnance detonation. Its crew of 40 requested immediate medical evaluation upon docking. The ship's tactical log contained 6 hours of normal reconnaissance data, then 4 hours of total sensor silence, which was itself abnormal, since sensor silence suggested either complete power failure or deliberate interference. Then a final 40 minutes of fragmented recordings that Sareth's intelligence team watched 3 times before writing their report, and rewrote the report twice before submitting it. Frigate 7 returned on schedule. Its captain, Commander Wreckage, submitted her report in person rather than through the standard data feed. She stood in Sareth's command chamber, a compact woman with the precise bearing of someone who had been told her whole career that she was too direct, and spoke for 40 uninterrupted minutes. This was remarkable, because everyone in the Dominion's Navy knew Wreckage as a woman of very few words. The fact that she had 40 minutes worth suggested that something genuinely unprecedented had happened. What she described did not fit the intelligence profile in any way that could be dismissed as error. The human orbital platforms were not where long-range scans had shown them, not slightly repositioned, gone, replaced with decoy emissions so precisely calibrated that only Wreckage's close-range active scan revealed them as hollow thermal signatures. The real platforms had moved, without detectable thrust, without drive emissions, without any propulsion signature that Wreckage's ship could identify. They'd relocated to positions that formed no recognizable defensive configuration. They weren't protecting the planet. They were distributed across the entire approach corridor in a pattern that, when Sareth's tactical officer overlaid it on a 3-dimensional grid, looked less like a defensive line and more like the inside of a sphere, as if something wanted you to come inside and then closed behind you. Frigate 19 had gone inside. Its last sensor ping showed 47 simultaneous contact signatures appearing at close range from absolute zero, no heat, no emissions, no mass shadow until the exact moment of activation. Objects the size of cargo containers, cold and invisible against the thermal background of space, drifting on ballistic trajectories that had been calculated weeks or months in advance. Then the ping ended, permanently. The crew of Frigate 11 had encountered the same phenomenon on the system's outer edge, objects appearing from nothing, activating once and only once, too small and too dispersed to target before detonation. Their tactical officer had attempted to establish firing solutions in the final recordings, and there was something almost unbearable about watching her, a skilled officer, trained to the highest Vetherac standard, searching methodically for a center of gravity that simply didn't exist. "They seeded the approach corridor weeks before we arrived," Wreckage said. "Everything out there has been sitting cold since before our long-range scans would have detected it. There are thousands of units, possibly tens of thousands, no command link, no network, each one independent and autonomous." She paused. "You cannot jam what has no signal, you cannot trace what has no source, and you cannot negotiate with a weapon that was already fired before the conversation started." Sareth's second-in-command suggested, quietly, that battle shock might account for the discrepancies. Sareth told him to pull Frigate 7's raw sensor logs and verify them independently. The verification returned 6 hours later, every detail confirmed. Sareth stood at the observation port of his flagship for a very long time. He thought about a phrase from the intelligence files, used casually by an analyst who hadn't understood what she was writing, that said humans never stop learning. He thought about what 10,000 years of fighting other humans, with escalating technology and absolutely no external check on the development of increasingly sophisticated methods of mutual destruction, actually produced. He doubled the vanguard. He advanced the timeline. He did not turn back. The Emperor's edict allowed no other option, and Sareth was, above all things, a loyal officer of the Dominion. It was perhaps the most expensive loyalty in galactic history. On Earth, 4.7 billion people watched the sky. Not because emergency broadcasts told them to, because no one could look away. Because for 6 months, every human being on the planet had lived with the knowledge that something was coming, something that had never lost, and the sky was where it would arrive. In those 6 months, humanity had done what it always did when threatened with extinction. It argued, panicked, organized, fractured, argued again, and then, with the particular concentrated fury of a species that had outlasted ice ages and pandemics and 2 near extinctions of its own making and still dragged itself forward, it built factories that hadn't run at full capacity since the resource wars hummed through the night. Orbital launch rates tripled, then tripled again. Engineers worked in rotating shifts. Soldiers trained without being told why. Children did homework in underground shelters and didn't complain, because children are more resilient than adults generally credit. Then, 8 days before the Vetherac Vanguard crossed the threshold into the inner system, Earth went dark. Not metaphorically, literally. Every satellite, every orbital station, every sensor platform, every communication relay cold, silent. To any external sensor sweep, the solar system's third planet appeared to have simply turned off. The faint thermal bloom of cities, consistent with a pre-spaceflight civilization's heat signature. Nothing orbital, nothing military, nothing that could be called a threat. The 300 ships of the Vetherac Vanguard entered the inner system and saw a quiet world. Commander Wreckage, leading the Vanguard's right flank, felt the wrongness before her instruments could confirm it. She had spent her career learning to trust that feeling. "It's too quiet," she told her crew. "All sensor readings are nominal, Commander," her tactical officer said. "I know," said Wreckage. "That's why it's too quiet." Then the 6 minutes began. No warning broadcast, no ultimatum, no dramatic declaration designed for the galaxy's watching audience. Just sudden, brutal, immediate action, which is, if you study 10,000 years of human military history, the method that has consistently proved most effective. The first autonomous kill units activated at 3:47 hours. They had been drifting on precisely calculated ballistic trajectories for 4 months, launched from Earth before the Vetherac fleet had even detected the human defense preparations beginning. Cargo container-sized objects, cold and radar invisible, positioned over months of patient orbital mechanics to arrive in exactly the right location at exactly the right time. Each carried one instruction, hard-coded before launch, impossible to countermand or jam. If a mass above threshold enters this volume of space, detonate. The Vanguard had no doctrine for this. 3 centuries of unbeaten Vetherac warfare were built around a single foundational concept. Every enemy has a center of gravity, a flagship, a command node, a key resource, a home planet. Find it, overwhelm it. The enemy collapses. This approach had been refined to extraordinary sophistication. Sareth's tacticians could calculate optimal engagement angles to 17 decimal places and model enemy fleet maneuvers from 3 sensor pings. But the kill cloud had no center. Every unit was independent. There was nothing to decapitate, nothing to jam, nothing to destroy that changed the behavior of everything else. The Vanguard tried to establish firing solutions on objects that were already spent and tumbling. They tried to retreat and found that the objects had also been placed in the retreat corridors, calculated for the positions the Vanguard would move to when they tried to escape the initial engagement zone. In the first 6 minutes, 41 warships were destroyed at close range. In the next hour, the second wave activated. positioned slightly deeper in the system, placed in the exact volumes the Vanguard had moved into while trying to escape the first contacts. Commander Wreckage broadcast a retreat order. 71 ships reached the outer system boundary. The other 229 were still engaged when Earth's orbital platforms came back online, not where they had been, but exactly behind the Vanguard's only viable exit vector, as if they had been waiting there for precisely this moment. Because they had. It lasted another 40 minutes. The battle for the outer system ended not with a surrender, not with a negotiated withdrawal, but with silence, the particular, total silence of 287 warships no longer transmitting on any frequency. Fleet Admiral Sareth received the Vanguard's final casualty report and did not speak for a long time. 287 ships. The finest warships in the Dominion's order of battle, ships crewed by the best-trained naval personnel in 47 star systems, commanded by officers who had earned their positions through decades of distinguished service. Gone. Not retreating, not damaged, not captured. Destroyed. In an engagement against a pre-FTL species that, according to every intelligence assessment he had been given, should not have been able to threaten a Vetherac scouting detachment, let alone a full Vanguard force. Sareth reviewed the sensor logs personally, alone in his war room, with no staff to observe his expressions. He watched his ships try to fight a cloud. He watched his captains, trained, decorated, multiple campaign veterans, searching for the throat of this enemy and finding only air. He watched 300 years of accumulated tactical doctrine fail in real time, not because it was badly applied, but because it had been built to fight a category of enemy that the humans simply were not. Then he found the detail that stopped him completely. During the entire 6-hour engagement, Earth's surface weapons had not fired once. They hadn't needed to, and they were saving them. Sareth called a full command council. His senior officers assembled in the war room with the careful composure the Dominion's naval tradition demanded, faces neutral, posture correct, every one of them doing what officers trained from childhood to suppress the signal of fear. He looked at them and asked the question that had been forming in his mind for 3 days. What do they want? Silence. Every species we've engaged has wanted something specific, he said. Survival, territorial sovereignty, resource access, ideological continuance, pride. What do the humans want from this engagement specifically? His tactical officer, Subcommander Ron, spoke carefully. According to all available intelligence, they want to remain unoccupied. Then they are not trying to defeat us, Sareth said. The words formed slowly, the way important things do. They are trying to make defeating them cost more than it's worth. Every action they've taken, the drone clouds, the repositioned platforms, the autonomous kill systems, every one of it, it's not designed to win. It's designed to exhaust us, to trade cheap things for expensive things until we are bled dry of ships and will and political capital. Nobody spoke. They had all understood this the moment he said it, and nobody wanted to be the first to say what it implied. That the Dominion, the undefeated empire, had sailed directly into a war of attrition against a species for whom attrition was not a tactic of desperation, but a philosophy of survival they had been practicing against themselves since before they left their caves. 3 weeks later, a small engagement near one of the giant planet's orbital stations resulted in the capture of a human military officer named Lieutenant Farrukh Tashkentov, not a battlefield commander, not a special forces operative, not anyone whose capture would matter strategically. A logistics coordinator with calloused hands and tired eyes who had been in the wrong corridor at the wrong time. Sareth had him brought to the war room and spoke to him through a translation system for 2 hours. He asked Tashkentov about the drone clouds, the decoy emissions, the orbital relocation system. Tashkentov explained each one without hesitation or evasion because, as he noted calmly, none of it was secret anymore. It had already been deployed. There was nothing to protect by staying quiet. Soreth asked how long humanity could sustain the current rate of material and personnel loss. Tashkentov looked at him. His expression was not hatred, not defiance, not the particular blankness of someone trying to hide fear. It was something else, something that had the weight of deep familiarity, as if he were being asked a question whose answer he had known so long he'd stopped consciously thinking about it. "As long as it takes," he said. Soreth asked one final question. "Does your military have a name for this kind of fighting? This grinding, attritional, exhausting kind of warfare?" Tashkentov considered for a moment. Then, for the first time in the 2-hour conversation, something moved in his face that might have been a smile. "Yeah," he said, "we call it Tuesday." Soreth sat alone for 3 hours after that. He thought about 47 star systems. He thought about 300 years. He thought about the edict. Then he committed the main fleet and moved toward Earth, because an emperor's order did not include the option of wisdom. Dr. Hanna Voss watched the main Vethorak fleet enter the inner system from a monitoring station cut into the basalt 1 kilometer beneath the surface of Iceland. She was not alone. 43 engineers occupied the stations around her, their faces blue-lit by tactical displays showing the incoming fleet's formation. General Marcus Webb stood at her right shoulder, looking at the numbers with the expression of a man who had made peace with outcomes beyond his control and found, on the far side of that peace, something almost like calm. "They've committed everything," said her lead analyst. "All remaining 900 warships, capital formation, tight grouping. They're going for orbital dominance, move to bombardment posture." "That's exactly what we needed," said Dr. Voss. She pulled up a map on the central display. It had no military markings, no targeting grids, no engagement vectors, no threat assessments. It looked, to an uninformed eye, like a geological survey, contour lines, depth measurements, mineralogy notations, and scattered industrial installation markers spread across 6 continents and 2 ocean floors. Webb had seen this map so many times in the preceding 4 months that he sometimes saw it when he closed his eyes. Deep anchor, 9 years in planning. The last 4 months in frantic, around-the-clock final construction. The engineering principle was not complicated. The execution had nearly broken every engineer who worked on it. A railgun accelerates a projectile electromagnetically. The barrel's length limits terminal velocity, longer barrel, faster projectile, up to the structural limits of the materials. Earth's most advanced orbital railgun platforms could achieve 12 kilometers per second. It was impressive for an orbital platform. Dr. Voss had asked a different question 9 years ago, staring at a geological survey map and thinking about what the planet itself was made of. What if the barrel was 4,000 kilometers long? Deep anchor was not a gun. It was 6 guns, each 4,000 kilometers of electromagnetic accelerator trench carved into the continental bedrock, 3 on land, 3 running along ocean floor trenches, lined with superconducting coils cooled to near absolute zero by systems that had taken 4 years alone to engineer. The power source was not reactor-based. No reactor could produce sustained sufficient energy. The power came from 43 geothermal taps sunk into the mantle, each one disguised for years as industrial infrastructure. The projectiles were tungsten iridium slugs the mass of heavy trucks, loaded into the accelerator chambers over 3 months and registered in every external sensor survey as mining equipment. For 9 years, Deep Anchor had been the most classified project in human history. For 4 months, it had been the reason anyone was still fighting. The Vethorak fleet, having lost nearly 300 ships in the outer system and seen its vanguard wiped out, made the only decision a conventional military doctrine suggested: achieve orbital dominance through mass formation, then conduct planetary bombardment until the enemy signals submission. Get close. Use numbers. End it. Against any conventional planetary defense, this was a reliable approach. against a species with orbital platforms and atmospheric fighters and surface missiles. A 900-ship formation in bombardment posture was essentially unstoppable. Earth let them settle into position. Webb watched the tactical display as the Vethrak fleet arranged itself in the tight bombardment formation above the equatorial zone. 900 ships, weapons charged, targeting locked on 16 population centers. A ceiling of metal and fire hanging above the world. "They think they've won," Webb said quietly. "Yes," said Dr. Voss. She looked at the geological map, then at her lead engineer, a woman named Dr. Seo-Yeon Park who had not slept more than 4 hours in the past week. "Begin the charge sequence." 11 minutes. That was how long it took to bring all 6 accelerator arrays to full power through the geothermal network. During those 11 minutes, 4 Vethrak warships broke from formation and began their first bombardment runs, targeting 3 cities simultaneously. The orbital defenses intercepted 2 of the 4, a success rate that would have seemed miraculous 6 months ago and felt, in this context, like watching 2 umbrellas hold back a flood. Hundreds of thousands of people died in those 11 minutes. Dr. Hannah Voss watched the strike alerts appear on the secondary display and did not look away, because she had decided, 9 years ago, when she first wrote the Deep Anchor proposal, that if this day ever came she would not allow herself the luxury of not seeing what the decision cost. This was the price. These were the names she would carry. At the end of the 11th minute, the charge indicators across all 6 arrays turned green. "Fire," she said. The firing lasted 11 minutes and 40 seconds. Across 6 continents and 2 ocean floors, the ground moved with a sustained, bone-deep vibration that no instrument had been built to measure, because no instrument had anticipated it. People in cities, 1,000 kilometers from the accelerator trenches, felt it through their feet. Birds took flight from every roof and tree in a widening circle, and did not land for hours. The ocean surface above the submarine arrays churned in long, straight lines, as if something vast was running beneath it. In the accelerator chambers, tungsten-iridium slugs the mass of passenger aircraft were accelerated from 0 to 62 kilometers per second, over 4,000 kilometers of tunnel, exiting into the sky on trajectories that had been calculated and recalculated by 17 separate teams of ballistic engineers over the preceding 9 months. The muzzle velocity was not the highest achievable. Dr. Voss had designed for sustained rate of fire over maximum terminal velocity, because 900 ships in a tight formation required throughput, not precision. Each slug was already targeted before it was loaded. The targeting was not based on where the ships were. It was based on where they would be. 64 rounds per minute. 754 rounds over 11 minutes and 40 seconds. In the vacuum of low orbit there was no sound. There was only light, the brief, white-hot flash of kinetic impacts at a fraction below relativistic speed, each one releasing energy greater than any individual nuclear warhead in humanity's existing arsenal. The Vethrak fleet, packed into bombardment formation over the equatorial zone, had not been designed for this. No fleet had been. The formation that made a bombardment run devastating, tight, coordinated, ships close enough to provide mutual fire support, was the exact formation that made survival impossible when the rounds came up from below. The fleet's command network registered the first 12 impacts and issued a dispersal order. By the time the order reached the formation's outer elements, 230 ships were gone. The survivors ran. Every direction, maximum thrust, emergency protocols. Sareth's surviving flagship drifting, half its command systems dark, broadcast a retreat order on all frequencies. Deep Anchor's outer arrays had been aimed not at where the fleet was. They had been aimed at where it would go. The mathematics of panic are surprisingly consistent. A fleet that has just watched 200 of its ships destroyed in under 3 minutes runs in the direction that offers the most open space, the least apparent threat, the most navigable exit vector. Dr. Voss's team had modeled this. They had modeled it for a fleet of exactly this size, in exactly this formation, with exactly this number of probable surviving vessels, over 9 months of calculation. The outer arrays fired their second and third salvos at trajectories that intercepted the retreat paths of ships that hadn't begun running yet. Most of them ran exactly where the calculations said they would. 4 ships survived. 3 because their captains, by instinct or luck or some quality of mind that had nothing to do with training, reacted in the first 3 seconds and ran the wrong direction, the unexpected direction, the direction the targeting algorithms had weighted at less than 4% probability. They ran for the system's edge at full emergency thrust and were not pursued. Earth had no ships capable of pursuit, and Dr. Voss saw no reason to fire at ships that were already leaving. The 4th survivor was found 3 days later by a human salvage crew, drifting and powerless, engines failed, crew alive and in shock. It had been outside the formation's edge when the firing started, outside the solution, alive by malfunction. On Earth it stopped. The silence afterward was not triumphant. Triumph has a sound to it, a release of held breath, a roar from a crowd, something that marks the boundary between before and after. This silence was different. It was the silence of people who had been surviving at maximum intensity for 6 months and had just reached the edge of the thing they'd been surviving toward and hadn't yet processed what the other side of it looked or felt like. The cities that had been struck were still burning. Field hospitals were overwhelmed. Engineers who had spent 4 months building weapons and fortifications were now trying to remember how to build other things. Soldiers sat in rubble with the particular exhausted blankness of people whose nervous systems have simply used everything up. In the remains of a suburb outside Nairobi, Sergeant De Jong sat on a collapsed wall and looked at the sky. The Vethorak ships that had burned on atmospheric entry had left long pale contrails in the upper atmosphere, bright threads unraveling in the stratospheric wind. They were beautiful, in the way that things are sometimes beautiful when they are also the end of something. A girl named Amara sat down next to him. She was 11. She looked up at the pale lines and then at him. "Did we win?" she asked. De Jong thought about it for a long time, long enough that she thought he hadn't heard her. Then he said, "We're still here. That's what winning looks like." She considered this, the way children consider things that adults say when adults mean more than they're saying. "Will they come back?" she asked. "Maybe," he said. He turned a piece of broken concrete over in his hands. "But they know what it costs now." Part VII, the new constant. The 4 surviving Vethorak warships returned home, and the journey took 32 days. None of the 4 captains opened communication channels to the others during that time. There was nothing that needed saying. They had all reviewed the sensor recordings independently. They had all run the arithmetic. The arithmetic produced the same number every time, 8. That was how many warships out of 1,200 had survived contact with humanity, 4 from the Vanguard and 4 from the main fleet, a number so small it barely registered as a fleet casualty. It registered, instead, as the statistical definition of annihilation. The Emperor received them in the great throne room, beneath the obsidian arches that had overseen 62 reigns. He listened to all 4 captains deliver their reports in sequence, his expression unreadable, his court silent. He watched the sensor footage from the main fleet engagement. He watched the ground fire. He watched the pale flash of 900 ships losing coherence in real time. He dismissed the captains. For 3 days, no orders came from the throne room. The Dominion's military council convened and convened again without resolution. Prelate San stood alone in his office, looking at a star map, turning over a word he had not used in 30 years of government service: unrecoverable. The word applied to losses that could not be rebuilt within a politically survivable timeframe. 1,200 warships represented 40% of the Dominion's primary attack capacity. The shipyards could replace them in 40 years. On the fourth day, Earth transmitted a message. It was not a victory declaration, not a list of demands or terms, not a territorial ultimatum or an announcement of war aims. It was a data packet containing the complete, unedited, time-stamped sensor record of the entire engagement. From the moment Frigate 19 went silent in the outer system to the moment the last drive signature of the 4 retreating survivors faded from the deep array tracking network. Every human loss was included, every city strike, every hospital overwhelmed, every field commander's final transmission. Nothing softened, nothing removed, nothing framed to make humanity look more powerful or less damaged than it was. One sentence of text was appended at the end. We remain open to diplomatic contact. Prelate San read the sentence 4 times. Then he sat down, which was undignified, and laughed, not from amusement, but from the involuntary physiological response that sometimes occurs when something reveals itself to be so precisely, completely, and mercilessly intelligent that the only available reaction is surrender to the recognition of it. They'd sent the record of their own damage. They'd shown the burns and the hospitals and the casualties. They were saying, "We bled, we can do this again, we'd prefer not to, but look at what we built before you decide." It was not a threat. It was something more difficult to dismiss than a threat. It was evidence. The Dominion did not respond. The Emperor, for the first time in his reign, found himself without an edict to issue. But 23 other species responded to Earth's transmission within 72 hours. Some were civilizations the Dominion had conquered and occupied, who had been receiving the Dominion's triumphant broadcast of the supposed pacification, and had quietly, very carefully, been receiving something else instead through channels the Dominion hadn't known to monitor. Some were independent species who had watched the Vethrak fleet cross their sensor ranges for decades with the particular sick certainty of the inevitably occupied, for whom the word resistance had long ceased to feel like anything other than a euphemism for delay. Some were civilizations so far removed from the engagement that their signals were still arriving months later, species that had been watching the galaxy with the patient attention of those who understand that what happens to others eventually happens to everyone, and had simply never had evidence before now that things could go differently. Earth's diplomatic channel opened at 600 hours on a Tuesday morning, staffed by exhausted translators and foreign service officers running on synthetic caffeine and 4 months of accumulated anxiety that had nowhere left to go. It did not close for 14 consecutive months. In that time, 3 occupied species submitted formal requests for military alliance. 2 intelligence services shared targeting data on Vethrak fleet positions that had taken them decades to gather. 1 cephalopod civilization 300 light-years distant sent a message that took 6 weeks to fully decode and turned out to be, in the best available translation, something equivalent to, "We did not know anyone was going to do that." The subtext, worked out by a team of linguists who spent 4 months on the construction, was, "We thought the answer was no. We had given up asking the question." A new constant had entered the galactic equation, written there in the tungsten-iridium trails of 900 burning ships. Not humanity as the new empire, not humanity as conqueror, riding the Vethrak's collapse into the power vacuum. Not even humanity as the strong, exactly, because strength, in the conventional sense, was a thing the Dominion had in abundance and had lost anyway. Humanity as the answer to a question the galaxy had been asking in silence for 300 years. Is this simply the way things have to be? In the rebuilt suburb outside Nairobi, the construction still underway, the scaffolding still up, the ground still bearing the faint subterranean hum of a deep anchor array 300 meters below, Sergeant Deyoung helped a girl named Amara carry water to a distribution station. The pale lines in the sky were long gone. The work of rebuilding was slow and exhausting and would take years, and it would not be clean or simple or complete, because nothing humanity built ever was. He picked up a bucket and kept walking. That, too, was what winning looked like. And